Welcome to the Mystical Truths Podcast. This is Rebecca, and I'm really glad you're here. Let's unlock your world. It's interesting when anyone speaks about things that they have no normal way of knowing. But I think it's especially interesting when young children talk about being someone else or about memories and information that they have not had access to or experiences about. When they randomly and often casually share detailed memories, why wouldn't we listen and be curious? Spirit tells us that looking backwards is not generally helpful or recommended, whether it's looking back in this life or previous lives, if we're digging up bones, if we're just reliving the past. They say everything is in the now and moving forward. So when we're talking about the past, it should always be in a forward-going kind of way. Where can I go with that information? How is that helpful to me now? There are so many really great past life, real life stories, but I'm going to share just two of them with you here, and we'll talk about how they're useful in the now and going forward kind of way. So the first one is from a book called Return to Life by Jim B. Tucker, MD. He shares several stories that he's researched, but the one I'm going to use here is about a woman whose deceased son seems to have come back to her again in another life. So the story begins with her son, Kevin, who at around 16 months of age began limping. And after a couple months or so, about 3 months, he was limping all the time. They did a bone scan, which came back normal, but they said there was fluid in his hip. A couple days later, he fell and broke his left leg, which became very swollen, so painful that he couldn't even have a cast on it. They kind of went back and forth on a diagnosis. He developed this tumor, or they found a tumor in his leg, cancer in his left eye. Treated him, long story short, treated him with chemo. He died anyway. So his passing was difficult for the family. But life had to go on. And eventually she divorced, remarried, had a daughter, divorced again, remarried, and gave birth to a son, Patrick. She said as soon as the nurse handed Patrick to her, she knew he was somehow connected to Kevin. There was some physical resemblance, but then she noticed a white opacity covering his left eye. He was essentially kind of blind in that eye, as Kevin had been toward the end of his life. The opacity did shrink over several weeks. She noticed a lump above his right ear, where Kevin's tumor was biopsied. There was an unusual birthmark, sort of like a line, on Patrick's neck, right at the area where Kevin's central line was inserted for chemo. Once he started walking, he had a limp. He'd swing his left leg out as Kevin did. The limp lasted until he was 5 years old. At 4 years old, he began talking about Kevin's life. He'd say things like, "I want to go to the other house." When his mother would say, "Why?" "Well, don't you remember?" he'd say. "I left you there." He said their home there was chocolate and orange, and they lived in a building that was brown and orange. He talked about events from Kevin's life. He even asked his mother if she remembered when he had his surgery, and she told Patrick, "You've never had a surgery." And he said, "Sure I did, right here on my ear." She didn't keep pictures of Kevin out, but eventually he saw a picture of Kevin. And he said, "Here's my picture. I've been looking for that. That's me." He described a small brown puppy they had for a while. He talked about a day that he went swimming at his grandmother's. He would talk to his brother, Jason, about heaven. She noticed that both Kevin and Patrick were soft-spoken. So just a quick run over of one story. He has a few books, I believe, Dr. Tucker. And I just thought that one was interesting because it's just a quick, easy way to see that there must be some kind of a connection. Is this Kevin coming back into a new body and remembering, still being connected with some of the stuff from the last life? Or is this a different soul coming in with information or knowledge about Kevin's life? and sharing that for our information here, for our learning, to help us understand that there is more to the life and death thing than what we think, that we are all connected. But what are the chances that she's going to have a second son that has those markers, the limp even, the information that Patrick had? Pretty interesting, I think. The second one's a little longer. This is from the book Soul Survivor by Bruce and Andrea Leininger. It's the past life recall of their son, James. When James was very young, still in diapers, on bottles, he started having nightmares where he would be kicking and thrashing and screaming. And at first they couldn't understand what he was saying. But the nightmares went on. Eventually they realized he was saying, "Plane on fire. Little man can't get out." They assumed that he would grow out of it. They called them night terrors. One night while Andrea was reading to him before bed, he rolled on his back and calmly acted out his nightmare scene. Little man can't get out. She brought Bruce into the room and they asked who the little man was. He said, "Me." "What happened to your plane?" "It crashed on fire." "Why?" He said, "It got shot." They asked who shot it. He made an odd face, rolled his eyes, and said, "The Japanese." The next day, his aunt asked him how he knew it was the Japanese that shot the plane down. And he calmly said, "The big red sun." A family member suggested, this had been going on for a little while, so somebody suggested that maybe it's past life recall. But that was way outside of their religious beliefs, especially for Bruce, so they dismissed it and went on. Now, we have to note, too, that, James, especially in the beginning, but like most kids, maybe all kids that recall, they only do it on their terms. They come out with little bits of information just casually or maybe in a nightmare, and you just want to take it as it comes without getting too excited about it, too heady about it, too questioning about it. Just take it as it comes and leave it casual. So another night, he began talking about it. And they asked, "Do you remember little man's name?" And he said, "James." They didn't think too much about that because that was his name now. They asked what kind of plane. He answered, "Corsair." He told them it took off from a boat called Natoma. When they asked, was it a Japanese boat, he said, "No, American." And Bruce, out of curiosity and a really strong desire to prove the past life concept wrong, began research which turned into extensive research, which I think is great because it gives us all these details. It connects a lot of dots, so it gets even more interesting. And I'm going to condense, there's a lot there that James came out with and they connected dots about. So I'm just going to run through some of the particulars. The Corsair did exist, and it was a World War II fighter plane. James was right about Natoma. It was actually called Natoma Bay. When they'd put him in the car for a long time, he had a ritual. He'd put him in the car seat. He would pull something over his ears and then reach up and pull something down. Just an odd little ritual he had. He also knew his last name, Houston. So he was James Houston. He also mentioned Jack Larson, who was a pilot also. And to show how extensive Bruce's research was, and this was back when internet wasn't anything like it is today, he did a search for a Jack, James, or John Larson, and there were many of them, but he figured it would have been between October 1943 and the end of the war, which was August 1945, because Natoma Bay was commissioned October of 43, and Corsairs didn't enter the picture until 1944. So he was really intently narrowing this down and wanting to prove it and disprove it at the same time. James saw a World War II picture at one point and said, "That's when my plane went down." Bruce found a World War II Natoma Bay Association reunion, which was very helpful. He asked a lot of questions, told them he was researching to write a book, and got a lot of answers. One time he asked a man, "Did you know a Jack Larson?" He said, "Oh yeah, I knew him. He flew off one day and never returned." From early on, he obsessed with planes and would play crash them, breaking off a propeller, all of them. Once he was able to draw, he'd draw scenes of violent battles and a plane crash with fire. When he was around 3, the nightmares tapered off, and he'd talk about his past memories a little more easily. When he learned how to write his name, he would write James 3. Always had the number 3 after the name James, and they asked why. He said, because I'm the third James. He had 3 G.I. Joe dolls given to him. They all had different hair color. He named them Billy, Leon, and Walter. One day they just asked him why those names. Why did you pick those names for your dolls? And he said he named them after his friends who met him in heaven. And they later found out that even the hair colors matched. They did find Billy, Leon, and Walter. And Walter had red hair, and so did the G.I. Joe Walter. All 3 of those men were on the roster and died within a few days before James Houston. He would even say, I salute you, and I'll never forget, there goes my neck. Kind of an odd statement for a kid just to make up. Bruce would take him to flight museums because he was so into planes. And he just knew specific details about the planes. He knew how they performed. He knew what their issues were. Very specific and accurate information. If they asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? He'd answer, F-18 Super Hornet pilot, then a Blue Angel pilot, a slot pilot. At a 2002 reunion, Bruce talked to a historian and found that Jack Larson was alive, and that there was a James Houston Jr. that did exist. So there's the James 3. In his last life, there was a senior and a junior. He was the junior. In this life, he's James again, third James. During a cleanup after a hurricane, Bruce had a moment, and he just was feeling the love, and he picked James up, and he hugged him, and he said, I'm so happy to have you as my son. And James said, I know, that's why I picked you. And he described that he saw them at nighttime eating outside a pink hotel in Hawaii before he was born, which had happened about 6 months before Andrea got pregnant, and they were talking about having a baby while they were having that meal. And they had not mentioned that to James, had no reason to tell him that story. Again, he's only 3 years old. After more extensive research, they located James Houston's 84-year-old sister, called her and explained the situation. She was very open to it. She said that they called him Jimmy, and she described him. Andrea said, do you remember anything about his death? And she answered, on the day he was killed, I was fixing up my house for his return. We were going to have a party. As I was cleaning, I had a very sudden feeling that Jimmy was in the room. His presence was so strong, I actually started talking to him. She also mentioned that Jimmy's best friend's mother had a dream that Jimmy came and said, I just wanted to say goodbye. Bruce still was not wanting to believe all of this, and he was holding out on the thought that James said Corsair, yet he could find no Corsair ever flew off of Natoma Bay. Jimmy's sister sent pictures of him. One was of his squadron, and in the background was a Corsair. Another one was James Houston standing right in front of a Corsair. Bruce found that the Natoma Bay was a U.S. ship, not a Japanese one. He did find proof that James Houston did fly a Corsair, and his plane did get shot down in World War II. One day a man called regarding a post that Bruce had listed online. He said he saw the plane get hit. He told Bruce the whole story, and it matched James's. He said he was the last one to see Houston alive, and the look on the pilot's face haunted him because he didn't know who he was until now. When James talked to Houston's sister, Annie, he knew that they had an older sister, Ruth. He spoke about their mom, their dad, their sister in a very familiar way. He even talked about how his alcohol-driven dad would smash things, and he had to go to rehab, which he called a sanatorium, which is a word we don't use anymore. He also knew that Ruth was mortified that because of that, his mother had to get a cleaning job with a very prominent family nearby. When James was around 5 years old, Jimmy's sister sent a painting of Jimmy, and he opened it, looked at it, and said, well, where's the one of you? Which was a real shocker to her, because she never mentioned how would he have known that the artist did a painting of her too. It was in her attic. So there's, of course, more to the James 3 story and the details he recalled, but I'm sure you get the point, Those facts were remembered by a child who had no exposure to that depth of information. This was back when internet was fairly new or newer. Kids didn't have their tablets and YouTube Kids or easy access to data. But even so, what kid just thinks up true facts from years ago and knows details about planes in the way that he did? So I love the fact that this is a thing. There are so many stories about kids who just remember things. Some maybe not in as much detail as James, but I think that went that way because of the research that was being done and the dots that were being connected. And it's really great for all of us to know. Not all parents are that curious or wanting to prove it wrong so much that they'll do that kind of research. We also have to watch because some parents, I remember a story about a parent who was in a different country and their culture believes in reincarnation, of course, and this parent was just certain that this child they were having was going to be a reincarnated, very famous person. I forget who it was. And the child grew up saying that he was a reincarnation of that person. So, in that case, you have to wonder, was that the influence of the parents, or did the child really have that other life? So I think the facts are important. Connecting the dots is a nice thing. But, like I said, past life recall should be a moving forward kind of thing. There's no reason to relive the past or obsess with the past or need to maybe see all of your past lives. Or if there is a point to a past life serving you now, then of course. If we look at the Kevin Patrick story, that shows some sort of soul progression. And I think just the information, just the fact that it is a thing, is educational to all of us. It helps us understand that there is more, that we do continue on. James's family was able to take him to the site where Jimmy's plane went down. They tossed in flowers, and he broke down, cried, and let that life go. They helped him to understand that that was then, this is now. I saw the original story on TV years ago. I got the book, read the book, and years later, somebody did a follow-up. And he was, I think, a young teenager at that point, and he said, I know that life existed, but I really don't think about it that much. So the recall served its twofold purpose, really, in helping that soul move into this next life and release the trauma from the last one. And it's not always about trauma in a past life anyway. And, like I said, it helps all of us. It's just good to know. So some things we've learned in working with kids as they remember is to be open. Let them initiate the topic. I don't know if we necessarily have to be saying to every child, do you remember who you were in your past life? Do you remember anything? Like I said, why look backwards unless it's serving some purpose in going forward? Generally, they'll shut down when you question them too much, or if you get judgmental or pushy. Just keep it casual, very matter of fact, curious, and respond briefly to what they offer. Take it as it comes. When we do ask questions, we only want to ask questions that don't suggest answers, like, and then what happened? Or did it have a name? Versus, did you fly the plane over enemy territory? So just casual questions that don't really point in any direction. We've also noticed that when they're talking about their memories, their past life memories, it's different than when they are being in their imagination. So when they're being imaginative, it's a whole different vibe, it's a whole different conversation than when they're remembering. When they remember, it's just like they're remembering something that happened 2 days ago. They usually only offer a few short statements at a time. Sometimes you just have to leave it at that. If they're afraid, this is an important one, if they're afraid or they're bothered by a memory, just remind them that that life is over and they're in this new life now and that they're safe. You can calm them by being supportive of the past and reassuring of the now of this life. I think it's a good idea to keep a notebook if it's something that begins to keep happening. Maybe you can connect some dots. Also, past life regression is not recommended for kids. It's just not a good fit for kids, and I don't see the point to it. If they remember some things, they remember some things. Help them go forward. Because like I said, Source is all about our motion forward. So have we had past lives? Well, Spirit says yes every time we ask. And the evidence that we have says yes. And it just seems logical, doesn't it? That we would not only have this planet to come and play on, but others too. There has to be more. You know, we're told that as souls, we project a fraction of our attention into a life experience very intently. And we don't have a lot of memory, and sometimes no memory, of anything but this life, because we're here to have this one. We're here to focus here. We're here on the leading edge of creation. We're thinking thoughts that have never been thought through our perspective in this personality before. That's causing newness. That's causing more. It's causing expansion. It causes eternity to be eternal. We just keep doing more. We just keep drumming up more, which is all, what creation is all about. So if you come across a child who talks about their other parent or who they used to be, where they used to live, just listen. Be reassuring. Help them to release that life, to honor that life, but to let it go and enjoy this one. And I think it's great to remind them that, yeah, you did have another life. We have much more than what we see in this life, in our house, on this planet right now. There's way more to you. There's way more to me. And I'm glad that you can remember that. But if it bothers you, let's not carry it forward. So how fun that we have some souls that remind us that there's more to all of us. And there's more to come for all of us. There's really no end. So enjoy this life that you're in. Do the best you can with it. Be easy on yourself. We're all banging around doing the best we can with what's in us right now, and that's always changing. That fluctuates. We wobble. We don't wobble. But we're all guided. We're all loved. And we're pretty strong souls to be here. This is not the easiest place to be, by far. But it can be. It can be a good life with all the mixed in contrast. So I think it's helpful to think to yourself, okay, so this is my life right now. What do I want to do with it? Where do I want to go? I'm free to do whatever I want in this lifetime. And I don't have to get it all right if there is such a thing as getting anything wrong, because I just keep expanding. And there's so much more to come. You can find me at mysticaltruths.com.